Okay, we see some students starting to join us, so we'll wait just a minute while more of our students join us. We thank you for joining us on this Monday afternoon. It's sunny here in Binghamton. I hope everyone is well as we're sitting home. We've got an exciting talk today about drugs, about good drugs and bad drugs. So we hope our students will get a lot out of it and have an opportunity to ask questions as well about our psychology department, about the topic in general, and just about Binghamton. My name is Carrie Feierabend. I will be helping out our professor today and asking him some of the questions on the back end. We also have an admissions counselor who will be in to answer any questions students may have in our Q&A. We have turned the chat function off, but any questions you have, you can direct to that Q&A area, and we'll try to answer them either throughout the presentation, or we'll have Dr. Marvin Diaz answer them live at the end of the presentation. And we will be utilizing the polls feature as well. So Dr. Diaz will offer some questions throughout his presentation, and you can feel free to interact with us and use those polls so we get a sense of where our students are at, what you're thinking, and Dr. Diaz can use those to propel his talk as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Marvin Diaz, who's an assistant professor of behavioral neuroscience. And Marvin, you can take it away.
Great. Thank you for having me here. It's very exciting to speak a little bit about what's going on in the psychology department, and specifically in the line of work that I do. So I'm an assistant professor in the psychology department, which is broken up into three specialty areas: the behavioral neuroscience, which is the one I'm a part of, as well as clinical psychology and cognitive and brain sciences. And so the expertise in those department encompasses those three general specific areas. Our department is actually one of the largest departments at Harper College. We serve about 750 majors, and we also are a big component of the Integrative Neuroscience program that's offered at Binghamton University. That's not a department of itself, as it's comprised of faculty from psychology, biology, anthropology, and a couple other departments. But psychology provides a big component of that integrative neuroscience program. So based on my expertise, I wanted to start by, I wanted to speak a little bit about the kind of work that I do, as it's a very relevant topic in our society, and it has been for historically. And so the title of my talk today is, Are All Drugs Actually Bad for You? The 5 W's about drugs and the brain. So before I get going, I wanted to pose a poll question that I'm going to show on the screen, and you guys should be able to see it on your end as well. And so the question is, why have you joined this webinar today? Is it because you're interested in learning about drugs, interested in learning about the brain, interested in learning about what drugs do to the brain, or you really don't know? It's just something different to do during the quarantine. So I'll give a few moments for people to answer. So remember, nobody's judging here, so people can feel free to answer. Okay, good. So we got the vast majority are interested in learning about the brain, and we'll definitely be covering a little bit about this. And then the second place was interested in learning about what drugs do to the brain, which is, again, mainly what we're going to be talking about. And I'm glad at least one person just really wants something else to do during this time of quarantine. Okay, great. So let's start with basically going over these 5 W's that I mentioned in the title, which are pretty common questions that people oftentimes have about drugs. And these are things that include who is safe or vulnerable to drugs and drug-taking behavior. Also, what drugs are actually worse than others? Are there specific drugs that may be worse? And basically, once people do engage in drug-taking behavior, where is it that these drugs are having their effects on? And specifically in the brain, what are these big impacts that drugs may have? And also, when do people typically experiment with drugs? So this is a very important thing, given especially the population that's probably listening to this webinar. And finally, why should I care? Why should you care about learning about this topic specifically? So I'm going to go through these 5 W's, and I'm going to kind of combine them, lump them into specific um, categories that kind of help me address these points more concisely. So let's start with the who and the when. So who is it that's vulnerable? Well, in reality, everyone's vulnerable to drug taking. And the thing is that nobody knows who is maybe more at risk than the other. But one thing that we do know is that genetic predisposition and our genes really do foster and facilitate the predisposition to some of the more consequential effects of drug taking behavior. So we know this to some extent. We don't know exactly all the details about it, but we know there's a big genetic component to drug taking behavior and in general to addiction, which is kind of what this will eventually conclude in. And so besides these who people, that having a genetic predisposition will increase your vulnerability, we know that adolescence is actually also another specific population that is extremely vulnerable to drug taking behavior. And so here I have a diagram showing that adolescence, this is adolescents ranging between 12 and 20 years of age, is usually a period when individuals experiment with drug taking behavior. And so what I have here in this diagram from the National Institute on Drug Abuse is that this is showing teens who use vaping devices. And what we see here is that starting in 8th grade, so about 12 to 14 years of age, we already start seeing these numbers increase in vaping. And this is in past year vaping. And by 12th graders, we see that the percentage has risen to about almost 40% of 12th graders vaping. We're also, if we break it down to nicotine, marijuana, or even for just flavoring reasons, we see that still the numbers do escalate through this high school period. And so this is that typical adolescence age when people start to experiment with drug taking behavior. So this is with vaping, but we also see even looking at something like binge drinking of alcohol, which is usually enough alcohol to get you to the legal driving limit of 0.08, which usually takes about 4 to 5 drinks in a sitting for a man and about 3 to 4 for a woman. We see that over time, although since 1993 the levels have dropped up to 2018, there's still a significant portion and percentage of high schoolers who drink binge amounts of alcohol. So these are pretty high levels of alcohol. And we see that between 8th and 12th grade, the numbers increase pretty dramatically. So this is an example of why how adolescence is a time when individuals begin to experiment with drug taking. And the important thing, though, is, and somewhat problematic, is that this is also a time where there is significant brain development going on. And so what we see here, hopefully you can see my cursor, is that in the diagram on the top, we see these are scans, brain scans, tracking brain development between ages 9 and 20. And the more blue and purple the brain is, the more developed it is. And what we see is that between ages 8 and 20, there is a dramatic increase in brain development. And so adolescence doesn't end when people graduate high school at age 18. It actually continues even into the early 20s. And besides this increased development that occurs in adolescence, we see in the graph on the bottom that there are still many sensitive periods of brain development where exposures to drugs, whether it's alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, as we'll talk about in a moment, can still affect the development of the brain. And so this graph shows between ages 0 months and 20 years, there are many brain regions that are still sensitive and vulnerable to the effects of drugs. Okay, so this is the who and the when. So I'm going to ask another question now. And so this question is going to be now more related to the specific drugs. So from the drugs below, which do you think is the worst for you? Is it alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, or Adderall? And so I selected these 4 drugs because these are some of the drugs that people either have some negative association with or perception of, or it's drugs that may be already being used by individuals, by your peers, and by yourself. We'll wait for the results. Okay, good. So the vast majority, 83%, selected cocaine as the one being probably the worst for you, whereas alcohol, marijuana, and Adderall are basically pretty even. Only between 1 and 2 people um, perceive those 3 drugs as being probably not that bad for you. Okay, and so we can talk a little bit more about these specifics and why one of these may be worse than another, maybe in the Q&A session. But what I do want to now highlight and transition to is the next 2 W's. And which is the what and the where. So I want to start with the what. And the what is what drugs are worse for you, which is basically what that last question I asked the audience was. And so in reality, one thing that we have to consider are the risks and the benefits that are associated with the drug that's being used, whether it's for recreational reasons or sometimes, as we'll talk about, sometimes for therapeutic reasons. And so here's this list. I've added a new drug to this list that wasn't in the question, and this is the opiates, such as heroin or something like oxycodone. So we have alcohol, marijuana, cannabis, opiates, and amphetamine, which Adderall is an amphetamine. And so what are the benefits with using these kinds of drugs? Well, people drink alcohol because it tends to relax people socially. It makes us a little more less anxious and more willing to interact with others. And it's just kind of part of our society. We have a drink with a meal and so on. So there's that benefit from alcohol. With marijuana and cannabis, there's this increased awareness and application of using marijuana because it helps manage pain. But most people who smoke marijuana and use cannabis products use it because it makes people very relaxed, and that's kind of one of the benefits of it. When we look at opiates, we know that opiates are prescribed for pain relief, and even opiates like heroin, which is more of a street opiate than a prescribed opiate, also have pain relieving properties. And finally, amphetamine, which, as I mentioned, Adderall is an amphetamine, which is prescribed for ADHD, is used to increase focus and basically to treat ADHD. So there are clearly some benefits to using any one of these drugs, whether it's legal or not. However, we have to consider the risks. And some of the risks here, which I hope you notice right away, is that all of these classes of drugs have the risk of addiction. And here I have in parentheses AUD, CUD, OUD, and SUD. And basically UD stands for use disorder, which I have here in my little legend at the bottom. And that first letter describes the drug. So alcohol use disorder, cannabis use disorder, opiate use disorder, and stimulant use disorder. So there's the risk of addiction to all of these drugs, even something like amphetamine. And so, but beyond that, there's also issues, the risk of liver disease and death with alcohol use. There's the risk of lung disease and death with marijuana use and cannabis use, as well as other smokable drugs like nicotine. There's, of course, the risk of overdose and death with use of opiates, whether it's heroin or something like oxycodone. And then even with amphetamines like Adderall, there is the risk of overdose and addiction, especially in those who use it for recreational reasons and not for treatment reasons to treat their ADHD. So again, we can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A. So this is the what now. But what about the where? So where is it that these drugs are having their effects? Well, these drugs produce the effects on our behavior and change our behavior by having direct effects on our brain and the way our brain functions. And everything that changes in our brain leads to a change in our behavior. And so whether it's something natural like cannabis, marijuana, or even a mushroom, or whether it's something that is artificial like a synthetic opiate, all these drugs will have an impact on our brain. And now the important thing, though, is that when these drugs are being taken for long periods of time, for extended periods of time, they oftentimes lead to changes in our brain because our bodies don't like to be changed. And when our bodies are forced in a certain direction, our body tries to correct that and makes changes, and we call these adaptations. And specifically, when these adaptations occur in the brain, they're called neuroadaptations. And so what I have here on the diagram on the right is an image from a study back in 2002, and the study has been replicated many times. And what the study is looking at is they're scanning the brains of either control subjects or subjects who are known to be addicted to one of these various drugs. And here it's cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol, and heroin. And what we see that's glowing in their brain is a certain part of the brain that's involved in reward. And it becomes activated when we feel good experiences and euphoria. And what you can hopefully clearly see is that the coloration in this brain structure is very different between the control and the addicted brain. And specifically what it's showing is that there's less of the receptors, a specific protein in this part of the brain that's involved in producing reward. And what we see is that because there's less of it, that there is clearly a neuroadaptation going on. And the unique thing, or not unique thing, is that it happens regardless of the drug that's being used. So whether it's cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol, or heroin, we see the same exact neuroadaptation, suggesting that these drugs, even though they may produce very different effects behaviorally, and they may be taken for various effects, they ultimately end up producing the same type of neuroadaptations. And we consider this being almost a signature of addiction. So again, it's not discriminating against a drug. It's suggesting that all these drugs have the potential to make individuals addicted. Okay, so now let's conclude with this: why should I care? So why is it important to understand this? Well, talked about adolescence being this time when individuals engage and experiment in drug-taking behavior. This is also a time when the brain is undergoing significant development. And so if you imagine this graph I've created, where on the x-axis we have age increasing as you move to the right, and on the y-axis we have brain development. So as brain development increases, I drew this hypothetical line. This is basically the normal neurodevelopmental trajectory, that it increases as you grow up, your brain develops more. Now imagine at this maybe critical point in adolescence where there's still significant brain development occurring. There's some kind of a drug exposure that takes place, and maybe a large amount of drug exposure over many episodes. This drug exposure can lead to these neuroadaptations, which basically throws off this neurodevelopmental trajectory and now basically sets it off course. And potentially it might do it very drastically, like I've indicated in this graph, but it could maybe just shift it a little. But every little shift is going to have a long-term impact on an individual's function, on individual's behavior, and basically the risk for many other things in the future. And so what are these risks? Well, there's risks for substance use disorder, which, as I described in the last slide, basically means addiction, whether it's to alcohol, to cocaine, to marijuana, and so on. This can also lead to an increase in mental illness, such as anxiety and depression. And it can also have a lot of effects on learning and memory as well, which are important things that we all need to survive, to function in our society, and to advance as we grow up and mature. So this is the big why should I care? Okay, so one thing that I want to highlight is that at Binghamton University, we have a number of centers and research programs that actually focus on this kind of research. And so this is the addiction research that happens at Binghamton University. We have an alcohol research center called the Developmental Exposure Alcohol Research Center. It's one of three alcohol research centers that are funded by the NIH across the country that focus only on development. We also have a training grant for graduate students that is also funded by the NIH that focuses on developmental and neuroadaptations in alcohol and addiction. And then we have a subgroup of faculty who are heavily involved in another big group of alcohol researchers that are a national group called the Neurobiology of Adolescent Drinking in Adulthood, or NADIA. So these are just three of the big groups on campus that are actively involved in addiction research. But there are also many other labs that aren't associated with this that are also involved in other types of addiction research on campus, including in the School of Pharmacy and in the psychology department as well. So now that I've kind of covered this, I wanted to conclude with another question. So this is, do you feel different about drugs after hearing what I've told you? So basically, yes, no, or I really don't care. And then once we get through this question, I have a second question, which is, would you like to learn more about this topic? And one way to do this is you can join our numerous classes and research opportunities that Binghamton University has to offer. So let's see what some of these answers look like. Okay, good. So about 50-50 people feel different about drugs after this presentation. Nobody really doesn't care, so that's good to know. And then I'm glad to hear that the majority are interested in learning more about this topic. And so, like I said, there are various ways once you come to Binghamton University to be involved in either research through these centers that I just talked about and different types of grants, as well as taking various classes that focus on addiction and the effects of drugs on the brain, as well as just general classes that focus on the brain because of our focus through our psychology department and the Integrative Neuroscience program. Okay, so I think that is all that I have.
Thanks, Marvin. So I think we're going to get into our Q&A portion of our talk here. This is really informative, and we already have some great questions to be asked. So let's go back to the beginning of the presentation. One of the students is asking, is the conclusion about genetic predisposition based on correlation or actual genes that are linked to addiction?
That's a great question. And sorry, I think my internet's a little wonky right now, so let me know if you can't hear me. So there are correlations are usually the way a lot of this research initiates and highlights and identifies target genes. That's kind of what they're referred to as. And these targeted genes, there are a number of them that have actually been directly linked to addiction. And so I can't name off the top of my head individual ones because it really varies on the addiction to what the drug or the substance is, as well as what the behavioral correlate is to that gene. So whether it's a gene that's involved in something like impulsivity, which we know is highly related to drug taking behavior, or whether it's a gene that's related to how euphoric or rewarding an individual experiences a specific drug and perceives it. So it really seems to depend on the question and the behavior you're talking about, but there are many genes, and this list is a growing list that's being created of genes that are actually linked to addiction.
Thank you. So another question, maybe we can delve a little bit deeper. I know marijuana was one of or cannabis was one of the drugs that you talked about. So can you dive a little bit deeper into marijuana and its effects on learning, memory, and attention span in adolescence?
Yeah, it's a great question. And especially given the current situation of legalizing marijuana and the increase in popularity of marijuana for some of these potentially therapeutic reasons. So there's actually not a ton of research on the effects of marijuana in adolescents. And there's a lot of new research coming out trying to look at this. And the conclusions are a little, aren't very clear yet. So there are many studies that show that there are significant effects on learning and memory and attention. But there are a number of studies that also show that things seem to be pretty normal. And so it's not, we really don't have enough of a grasp on this line of work to really have a conclusion. And a lot of the thing that has to be considered is that there are many factors. It's not just about age and taking the drug. There are a lot of, like we just talked about, some genetic predispositions, how often, the frequency of the drug use, what other environmental factors are going on, whether it's a situation where people are stressed or whether they're not, and so there are a lot of other things that have to be considered, and the research it will eventually illuminate these answers and inform us on this, but we're really not to a point yet where we can make a strong conclusion.
Okay, great. And then a final question about the topic before there's some questions here specifically about the major and that. Is it possible for the brain to regain dopamine receptors if the addict stops using?
That's a wonderful question. And there is more evidence suggesting that there is a recovery if abstinence occurs, and there's more, but again, there are a lot of other factors. It's how long is the history of drug taking, what is the specific drug. One thing to realize is people who take drugs don't normally just take one drug. They might experiment with many drugs, and so it really depends on all these other factors, but there is a lot of promising research showing that there is some recovery, and there's a lot of research trying to figure out what other things can be done to help expedite the recovery if recovery is actually possible. And this is because our brain is, we call it plastic, because it seems to be malleable like plastic. We can change in one direction, which suggests it should be able to change in the other direction. And so we're just trying to learn how the brain does this to help with something like this and recovery. So great question.
Great, thank you. This next question, I think you and I both know the answer to, and it's a great one to answer, but as an assistant professor at Binghamton, do you work with undergraduates with research often?
Yes, absolutely. So research opportunities for undergraduates are plentiful at Binghamton University in the psychology department. We have hundreds of undergraduate research undergraduates who participate in research. Most of them are heavily involved in the day-to-day parts of research, and a lot of them end up being involved in independent projects where they can eventually have an honors thesis, and which is a pretty big deal as an undergraduate. And so that's something that we highly encourage, and it's a great thing, a great resource to have for people like myself.
Great. So another kind of question, and maybe you can give a little bit of a broader overview into the integrative neuroscience, kind of the major or the program at Binghamton. But the question is, what classes would you recommend a first-year neuroscience student would take? What research opportunities should we lean towards? This student in particular is not very keen on math, so how is math induced in the neuroscience major? So maybe just a broad overview of what that looks like.
Yeah, so I know there is a set recommended course load and when certain classes need to be taken. And in reality, what this neuroscience program, as I mentioned, it's an integrative neuroscience program. So there are classes that need to be taken on biology, on chemistry, physics, math, psychology. So it's a kind of a big combination of courses that really help prepare students to eventually either go to a specialization in neuroscience post undergraduate school or go to medical school or something like that. And so it's really difficult to give a recommendation for what a first year may need, because many first years come with variations in credits from high school and so on. So this is something that the academic advising, whether it's at the Harper College level or even in the integrative neuroscience advising, can recommend for incoming students.
Okay, thank you. And then one more related to the programming before we have a couple more questions related to the topic. Is there a research at Binghamton on psychedelics, and do you view them as a separate topic?
There currently isn't that I'm aware of, but this is actually a new growing interest in the field of addictions neuroscience and addiction science in general, because there's a lot of potential for psychedelics for therapeutic potentials, and we're learning quite a bit about that as a field. And this is kind of there's a new rise in the focus of this of the research on psychedelics in general. At Binghamton, not specifically that I'm aware of. So it's definitely a separate project, a separate topic, because it's a different drug class. But it's certainly something that could potentially pop up at Binghamton University as a focus of research soon.
Great, thank you. So a couple more questions related to the topic again. The first is, in terms of chemistry in the brain, why do different people have different experiences to the same drug?
That's a great question. And so there are a lot of, I keep going back to this idea of a lot of factors, and this is true for the actual direct experience that a user may have. And some of these factors here include, for the experience itself, include the general personality of the individual, which again is driven by their genetics and their past history, as well as their perception of what it is that they expect to feel when they take a drug, and which changes pretty dramatically from the first time somebody experiments with a drug to once an individual's been taking it for many episodes and many situations. And so this is a lot of the reason why the experiences are different, as well as just the general biology and chemistry of the brain. We all have different levels of activity in different areas, and that's what makes us all unique and different. So as a result of this, there are many different experiences, although we can tend to cluster some of the general effects, and they're pretty consistent depend on given for a given drug between different users.
Okay, thank you. And then another question here. So drugs such as marijuana tend to suppress cortisol production. High levels of cortisol have negative effects on brain development. So do you think that the negative effects of drug use outweigh the negative effects of cortisol levels, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And this actually highlights another factor that we really haven't talked about. I've kind of alluded to it without directly addressing it, is stress. And so we know stress, which cortisol is directly related with, being a general marker of stress reactivity. We know that stress is a big factor that drives drug-taking behavior, but drug-taking behavior also tends to increase stress reactivity in general. And so there's definitely a relationship there. And again, especially during a time when the brain is developing, all of these influences, whether it's the direct action of the drug or whether it's some indirect effect like stress, the stress response, and how that stress response is adapting, that really seem to influence how the brain develops. And there's a lot of work trying to understand this relationship, and it varies depending on the drug, as is highlighted here. Marijuana may do something that alcohol doesn't, or that cocaine doesn't, and so all these things have to really be looked at carefully.
Thank you. I'm going to expand on this next question a little bit. So what has your path to Binghamton been like? How did you end up getting to Binghamton and getting involved in this? And so to culminate in, what research projects are or were you currently working on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I trained in graduate school in a lab where we were interested in understanding the effects of chronic alcohol exposure, and particularly withdrawal from alcohol exposure, which usually manifests as a lot of anxiety, which makes alcoholics relapse and drink again to try to alleviate that anxiety. And during that time, I really became interested in what the differences were in how the brain responded to alcohol in adulthood versus at an earlier stage. And so I ended up doing what's called a postdoctoral fellowship, which is kind of a training phase between graduate school and a faculty position, studying the effects of prenatal alcohol exposure on the developing brain. And that really, once I got involved in that line of work, and when the job opening here at Binghamton University came up, they were really interested in recruiting somebody who focused on developmental alcohol exposure. And so that really worked out for me. And so since being here, I've been here now almost 6 years. My lab is really focused on understanding how prenatal alcohol exposure rewires the brain to produce a lot of the effects that we know that we call fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And there are a lot of different effects. We particularly focus on anxiety because that seems to be a very common symptom and consequence of fetal alcohol exposure. And so we're trying to understand how the brain rewires itself, how the communication in certain brain regions is different following prenatal alcohol exposure. And we've recently started expanding our research program to also start examining the effects of prenatal opiate exposure, given the current opioid epidemic and the fact that very little is known about what happens to children who are exposed to opiates in utero, and especially what happens to them once they grow up and become adults. Really, this hasn't really been tracked carefully until now, but it'll take 20, 30 years before these children that we are now tracking will be adults. And so we're trying to we use animal models to try to understand this, because the animals' brains tend to develop very similar to humans. And we can do this in a more abbreviated manner, where we can see a pregnancy in a human, of course, takes 10 months. Something like a rat or a mouse, it only takes about 25 days. And so we can get a much better picture in a much faster way.
Thank you. So another question about, I guess, your area of research. What is your view on the nature versus nurture debate regarding drugs? Is it upbringing just as important as genetics, or how do those both factor in?
So this goes back to a point I made earlier of the interactions between our environment and basically our past history and our natural biology. And so there's certainly a lot of influence of this genetics and it predisposing an individual. But if the individual, although they may be predisposed to, let's say, alcoholism or alcohol addiction, if they're not exposed to the right conditions and the right environment, then that individual may never actually develop this disorder. Whereas somebody who may have that predisposition and is exposed to the right conditions and environment may end up falling down that path. And so there's definitely a huge interaction, and this is something that myself and others at Binghamton are very interested in understanding, is this environment, gene, and environment interaction, and how that really changes the trajectory of the individual when they're actually exposed and given access to a drug.
Thank you. So I think we'll just wrap up with one final question here. So what, in your opinion, makes Binghamton different? I know the integrative neuroscience, I think, is a really unique field because it is so cross-disciplinary, across, you mentioned biology, psychology, chemistry. What could you say to help these students kind of understand what it is that we do at Binghamton that helps make it such a unique program?
Yeah, sure. So besides this integrative system that we have, at least for the neuroscience program, our research is very cutting edge. We're always, at least in the psychology and integrative neuroscience program, we have a lot of very active faculty who are basically the leaders in the field. And that's a big thing, even for undergraduates, because we foster a very large undergraduate research program as well. And so this really sets us up to produce students who are going to be very successful in the fields of psychology and neuroscience. A new thing that's coming to the university is an MRI scanner that's going to be basically shared across the university. And so there's now going to be a whole new line of research at Binghamton using imaging tools like MRI, functional MRI, and so on, which will take us to the next level, where we can now look at brains of humans while they're doing behaviors and so on. And so we really have a very good spectrum and an array of tools and research interests that really help students develop themselves and their general career.
Great, thank you very much. We just want to thank you again for sharing your expertise with us. I think students really enjoyed a lot of this, and I hope to see some of these students here on campus this fall, and perhaps in the neuroscience department. It looked like a lot of these students were really interested in studying the brain and learning more about it. So we just want to thank you once again, Marvin, for being on with us and for sharing your expertise.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed doing this. And I think I saw somebody ask what my email address is. I'm sure you can provide that for them.
Yep.
And so.
I did. I have sent the email out to the chat for our attendees to view. So if you have any follow-up questions or questions about psychology, I'm sure that Marvin would be happy to answer some of those. And I think that'll do it for today. If anyone missed any of the beginning of this, it will be recorded as well. So if you'd like to rewatch it, it will be on our website for our students to view once the recording is ready. So thanks once again, Marvin, for coming on, and we hope everyone has a great evening.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.